Chapter 23. Dashunde heard the rumble, and immediately ran for the nearest structure he could climb. Directly after he had attained leader, he had taken a group on a hunt, and he had heard the same rumble. It was the sound of many animals running in mindless Grai-Sui-Bepe. The Yautja had clambered onto a low rise and watched as a herd of four-legged hosts had stampeded past in front of them. Had they stayed on the low ground, they would have been trampled. He spotted a ladder bolted to a tall structure and ran for it. He had not found the students yet, but before he could do so, he needed to avoid being crushed by the stampede. He hoped the students would understand what the sound meant and seek high ground or protection. He growled in irritation as he climbed the rungs of the ladder. If they paid attention to his lessons, maybe they wouldn't die. If they had not listened, then they deserved to die. That was the way of it. His hope was not all that good, considering how well they've learned so far. Dashunde climbed as the rumble thickened into an all-encompassing roar. Noguchi buzzed the pens as low as she dared, and hoped the locks had opened according to the codes she'd set. The Rinth had been in the hot sunlight all day without food and a minimum of water. The sound of the copter must have echoed loudly in the pens. It only took one spooked animal to get it going, and as soon as one Rinth jumped forward, the rest followed. The animals tore through the doors she had unlocked. Within a few seconds, all of the Rinth joined the stampede, headed straight through Prosperity Wells. Anything small enough to get in their way was trampled, crushed, kicked aside. The searchlight on the copter illuminated the scene dimly. Noguchi only glanced at the panicked herds. She had her hands full piloting. Miriam Revna cried out in delight. "They just ran over about 24 of the unclassifieds." It was hard to hear over the clatter of hooves and the bellows of the frightened Rinth. Noguchi smiled tightly and pulled up on the control stick. She wanted to check and see if the ranchers had gotten out. She veered east. All she needed to see were the lights of the AVs. Noguchi allowed herself a short rush of relief. The low red and white lights were visible. The ranchers and staff were headed away from town into open desert. It was working. Her plan was working. She circled the copter back towards the lector to make another run on the animals. The colonists were headed to relative safety, and the Rinth was stomping everything in sight. Maybe she wouldn't have to sacrifice anything else. Of course, there were still the creatures on the ship to deal with, and it was probable that a few of the other kind had survived, but to take out the majority. As they neared the transmitting tower, Miriam sat up straighter and pointed. Noguchi shot a sideways glance at what the doctor motioned at. It was one of the warriors. It had climbed the ladder and was almost to the top, and there were 3 or 4 of the huge black bugs clambering up after him. Miriam saw the broken-tusked warrior nearing the top of the transmitter and pointed. He still wore the cast that she had strapped to him for his damaged ribs. "Machiko, look!" "What?" The stampede was deafening. Miriam shouted louder. "It's my patient! We have to save him!" Noguchi whipped her head around. "No fucking way! Those things are the reason we're in this mess!" She looked back at the controls. Miriam chewed at her lip in frustration. How could she make Noguchi understand? It was important, the most important thing in the world right now. She could not have said why. "He saved my life, Machiko!" Noguchi opened her mouth and then closed it. "Look, I don't... Please, Machiko, he risked his life to save mine." The doctor looked at her patient, getting closer to the top now. The dark, segmented creatures were also getting closer. "Please!" Noguchi didn't say anything. She veered towards the tower. "I must be out of my mind. That's it. I finally went insane." Noguchi steered the copter towards the tower in disbelief. What the hell was she thinking? Dr. Revna was a nice lady. Ordinarily, she wouldn't mind doing her a favor, but this... She watched as Broken Tusk kicked at one of the pursuers and then stabbed the closest one. The bug screamed and fell. He refused to give up fighting. She'd credit him that much. But she could barely fly. Even a trained pilot would have doubts about trying to hover next to a tower, and to save an alien that they knew almost nothing about. Except it had saved Miriam's life. Right. It would break every rule in her book to risk their lives on this, and she had about a second to decide. Below them, the Rinth ran on. The Shunde kicked at one of the drones, and then used the spear to take out the gut of another. It fell, still kicking, but there were two others. He heard a ship over the sound of the running hosts, but he ignored it. He had enough to worry about. On the ground, the bugs were no match, but fighting while hanging one-handed and almost upside down. The metal he gripped let out a high groan. He could feel the structure shift under the combined weight of himself and the drones. Again, the weak substance creaked and started to separate from the building. If he didn't think of something, he would be on the ground in a few breaths, fighting the hard meat and in the path of the stampeding hosts. The Black Warrior must wish for the Shunde's immediate company, and the Black Warrior eventually won all battles. Noguchi lowered the copter towards the tower, which had started to quake dangerously. It was collapsing under all the weight. Shit. Miriam fumbled around the console for a second and then hit a button. Her next words blared incredibly loud. "Grab the strut! We'll take you to safety!" Noguchi winced. The doctor had found the PA. She lowered the ship a little more. It was hard, but not as hard as she had expected. On the other hand, a series of red lights had lit up on the control panel. She was too intent on the task at hand to figure out what they meant, but she didn't want to find out the hard way. "Grab on!" Noguchi screamed to be heard. "I can't do this forever, Miriam! He doesn't understand!" The copter dipped, and then pulled up again. He had grabbed onto the strut. Noguchi let out a cry of disbelief. It had worked. Broken Tusk had jumped onto the copter. Now what the fuck are we going to do with him? And then everything happened at once. A dark shape lunged at them. Noguchi had time to register that it was one of the bugs before it landed on top of the compressors, on the same side as Broken Tusk. It scrambled to hold on, screamed. The copter tilted alarmingly, and Noguchi jerked the controls instinctively upward. There was a rending screech of metal as the tower collapsed, and everything turned the wrong way as the copter went down.